Hello and welcome to today's webinar, A Look Back and a Look Forward on LGBTQ Rights and Education with Rodney Wilson. In this session, participants will screen a documentary short about the events of 1994-95, including Rodney's coming out experiences and the founding of LGBTQ History Month, followed by a Q&A discussion about LGBTQ issues in education. A few housekeeping items to go over real quick. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we will get to them at the end, but please feel free to type those in at any time. We will be taking note of them, and please connect with us using the hashtags MCCA webinar, and we will be sending a recording of this webinar to those that registered today. Today's speaker is Rodney Wilson. Rodney Wilson has been an educator since 1990, serving in secondary, correctional, ESOL, ABE, and community college posts. He holds 2 graduate degrees in history and religion. In 1994, he became the first openly gay public school teacher in Missouri and founded LGBTQ History Month. I will now hand it over to Rodney. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you so much, Kaylin and Bobby, for inviting me to this session and organizing it. I really appreciate it. The title is A Look Back and then a Look Forward. So I thought I would start, before immediately introducing the film, I would start with a little bit of connective history in terms of education, opportunity in education, and how various groups have had to struggle over the last 100 to 200 years to find an opportunity to have equal educational opportunity. And starting with women, obviously, as we all know early on, education was primarily for boys. There were middle-class women, girls who went to finishing schools, they were taught the basics, but primarily they were there to become refined and they were there to learn how to find a husband. Beginning in the 20th century, early in the 20th century, by that point, most girls had equal opportunity to the local public school on par with boys, but post-secondary education continued to remain a venue primarily for American boys and not for American girls. In fact, Harvard Medical School did not admit its first female student until 1936. And Harvard Law School did not admit its first female student until 1950, not 1850, but 1950. Early in the 20th century, and even into the mid part of the 20th century, women, primarily single women, were school teachers. Problem happened, however, when they married. When they married, the thought was that a school teacher should be a single woman. The school teacher should be a man who might need to provide support for the family. Additionally, once married, a pregnant woman especially found a lot of discrimination in K-12 education and the few who were in post-secondary education teaching positions as well. And in fact, you may be shocked to learn that it wasn't until 1974 that the United States Supreme Court ruled that a pregnant woman could not be forced to take maternity leave. There was a Connecticut case that came before the court, and under Connecticut law at the time, a teacher who became pregnant had to take maternity leave at the 4th month into the pregnancy. She could not return to teaching until the baby was 3 months old, and until a doctor said it would be okay now medically for her to return. So women have also, like LGBTQ people, women have had to fight and advocate for themselves in order to get a place of equality in our K-12 and post-secondary institutions as students and also as employees. We all know the awful story of African-American attempts to be educated. It was illegal, in fact, to educate enslaved people. And after the Civil War ended, while the Freedmen's Bureau attempted to establish schools for Black children in the South and also for Black adults in the South who wanted to learn to read and write. This was an attempt that did not get widely spread. It was not widely supported. And within a few years of Reconstruction, you had the rise of white supremacy. You had the establishment of the Klan in 1867 in Tennessee. And a lot of those attempts were ended because of the onslaught against the idea of Black equal education. We know about the Brown versus Ward case of 1954. We know about how difficult it was to integrate Little Rock High School, Central High School in 1957. In fact, President Eisenhower had to send in the 101st Airborne. He had to nationalize the Arkansas National Guard just to protect 9 Black students who were integrating Central High School. We know about James Meredith in 1962 attempting to become the first Black student at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. And we know that President Kennedy had to send in U.S. Marshals to protect him. So there, looking back, we have 2 examples of women and African Americans. And that now brings me to the 3rd example: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, LGBTQI individuals. And the idea that gay people even existed was a mysterious notion, even prior to the 1980s. You might have heard of the Lavender Scare period in the 1950s, when the United States government was intentionally targeting mainly homosexual men, also some lesbians, in the State Department, in the Defense Department, in the federal government. The belief was that they were not secure in keeping secrets. They were not as loyal and faithful to the United States as they should be. And thousands of them were driven from federal government jobs. And all along, of course, tens of thousands of lesbian and gay people were driven from our military. And then in the 1970s, Dade County, Florida passed a civil rights amendment that protected lesbian and gay people from discrimination in Dade County. Some of you who were alive in 1977, as I was, might remember that Anita Bryant created an organization called Save Our Children, and she worked feverishly to see that Dade County piece of legislation overturned by an initiative and referendum process, and she was successful. The following year in California, the Briggs Initiative was specifically designed to see if the people of California wanted gay and lesbian teachers in their public school systems. The good news is the Briggs Initiative failed. The bad news is the Briggs Initiative sent out into the atmosphere of the United States an idea that gay and lesbian people are a threat to children, that gay and lesbian teachers are a threat in the classroom. I was 13 years old when the Briggs Initiative was the heated conversation topic of the day, and I remember it. And I remember also thinking at the time, I therefore am disqualified from ever being a teacher, because I was aware that I am gay since I was 8 years old, and this was happening when I was 13 years old. 12 years later, however, I did become a teacher, and I would like now to put a link in the chat section for that video, and that link will take you to the video itself. The reason we're not going to show it on the screen is we've learned that when we do that, it gets some glitches, so it's better for people to use their own broadband. So I'm going to put the link in the chat section, and we'll click on it at about the same time. It's a 26.5-minute video that talks about when I was a teacher in the 1990s, when I came out in the 1990s, when I started LGBTQ History Month in the 1990s, and the aftermath of that entire experience. So let me put that now in the chat section, and then you can simply click on the link. We can all do it at about the same time, and then we will rejoin this conversation in about 28 minutes, which would be 30, 48, about 10:55 at the latest. So everyone, please mute your microphone so we don't get the feedback. Click on the link in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we will watch it and then get back together. Okay, I think probably everyone has had a chance to wrap up the video. I appreciate everyone who took some time out of their day this 27th annual LGBTQ plus History Month here in the United States. History Month is also celebrated in other countries now. The United Kingdom, for example, in February, however, because October was Black History Month in the United Kingdom, so beginning in 2005, they decided to make February their LGBTQ History Month. Australia also celebrates in October. Canada celebrates in October. And in terms of looking forward, which was the second half of this event today, I would ask everyone who's watching to take a look around their building, their school, to see if here in October there's something that's been done. Here at Mineral Area College, in our concourse area, which is heavily trafficked, we have a trifold of various events in LGBTQ history and various personalities, Harvey Milk to Pete Buttigieg, Sylvia Rivera, Jodie Foster. Also in our library here at the college, the librarian, Ryan Harrington, put together a magnificent display. There's a website called LGBTHistoryMonth.com, and every year since 2006, they have put together 31 what they call icons of LGBTQ history. They're at 465 now, but every year they do 31. They make them as diverse and international as possible. And what Ryan did here in our library is he downloaded the one-page biographical data sheets on those 31, and then they're now in our library for the rest of this month. Another thing in terms of the future that I would suggest, take a look at your non-discrimination policy at your college. And if sexual orientation and gender identity are not included already, I would send a letter to the cabinet or the president of the college or the administrative leadership. Interestingly, here at the school I work at, we did not have in our non-discrimination policy protection for sexual orientation or gender identity. And when we got a new president 2 years back, who's young, he was 39 at the time, I approached him right away and said, you probably don't know, but we don't have these protections. And he himself went to the Board of Trustees and got it done. That in the past was something we had talked about often, but it just hadn't happened. So sometimes you'd be surprised how quickly changes can be made. And I think it's really essential that people know they cannot be dismissed from their jobs because they are gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. Now, the good news also is that this past summer, the United States Supreme Court in the Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia decision, in which they took 3 cases, one involving a gay man, one involving a transgender woman, and the other involving a gay man, all of whom had been fired, one in New York, one in Detroit, and then the name of the case in Georgia, they had been fired because they were gay, and in the case of the woman who worked at the funeral home, transgender. And the United States Supreme Court just this past summer voted 6-3 to make Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, make it inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity. So we've got federal protection now. We still don't in the state of Missouri, though we've tried to get our General Assembly to pass Missouri Non-Discrimination Act every year for about 25. They've been stubborn to do it, and neither have we had the opportunity for our United States Congress to do so. But by means of this Supreme Court decision, that's now the case, that there is a protected class. So there are things we can do looking forward. I think the biggest thing is for allies of the LGBT community to be openly allied and supportive. I think it's important for LGBT teachers and educators and administrators in pre-K through 12 and post-secondary to, as they are comfortable, to be out and open about that information. I think it's important that we begin to look at our American history classes, for example, and make certain that when we talk about the social revolutions of the 1960s, the American Indian movement, the women's movement, the Black civil rights movement, that we also include the LGBT movement. Make it an inclusive history, one that includes all of the people, not just some of the people. So I think these are some of the things that we can do as we look forward from the vantage point of late 2020 and attempt to project onto the future the vision or the goal that we have for how we would like our educational institutions to be acknowledging the roles of LGBT people and the LGBT people who actually do work there. I see, great, thank you. I guess that was probably Bobby who put up the link to LGBT History Month in our chat. I'm also going to put a link to a book that's fresh off the press, 2020. It's called The Educator's Guide to LGBT plus Inclusion. It primarily focuses on pre-K through 12, specifically on secondary, but there's also information in there about post-secondary, and of course, many of the suggestions for a secondary setting would be applicable in a post-secondary setting as well. So I'll open it up now to any of you who might have some questions that you would like to ask me, or any sort of commentary on the documentary we just watched, or you want a little more of the information or backstory, and you can put it in the chat, or I guess also, Kaylin, they can turn on their microphone and speak the question.
I don't know if Bobby has given participants that capability. So if they would type it in the Q&A or the chat, and I'm actually going to pull up my Q&A now, but we do have a couple of questions that were sent in ahead of time. How do you distinguish LGBTQ History Month from Pride Month?
Excellent question. Pride Month, of course, occurs in June. And the reason it occurs in June is that in June of 1969, at the Stonewall Inn, which was a little bar in Greenwich Village, New York, there was a police raid. Police were often raiding bars where lesbians, gays, transgender individuals gathered, arresting them, sometimes putting their names in the newspapers, ruining their lives, and so on. And that particular night in late June, they decided to fight back. Sylvia Rivera, Marsha Johnson, and others decided they would not, they would resist the arrest. And there were 3 nights of quote unquote riots. And of course, one person's riot is another person's protest. And that sparked what we consider to be the modern gay civil rights movement. So Pride Month is in memory of and celebration of that event. Now, when I founded LGBTQ History Month, at that time called Lesbian and Gay History Month, I picked October. And the reason I did that was June obviously is not in the academic calendar. And I wanted this to be an academic institution, secondary schools and post-secondary schools primarily. Also in 1979 and 1987, the first two marches on Washington for lesbian and gay rights were in October. And of course, October 11th, since 1988, had been National Coming Out Day. So of course, you can teach LGBT history anytime. You can do it also in June, but to be within the academic calendar, it's something that needed to happen during the school year. And that's why I picked the month of October, in addition to those other reasons. That's a great question.
Do you have an LGBTQIA plus group on your campus now?
We do. And that is something I forgot to mention in terms of how we move forward. That's another thing. Look on your campuses. Do you have a GSA, as it's traditionally been called, Gay Straight Alliance, sometimes now gender and sexual minority group, or just LGBTQ group and allies? And we do have one. And interestingly, ours just started last year. Getting the non-discrimination clause in our policy here at this school liberated people, freed up people from worry or concern. And last spring, COVID spring, right prior to the COVID dismissal, we had our first meeting for GSA, and we've had 2 meetings here this semester, and they've also been involved in these 2 functions we've had on the campus, as well as our diversity committee. And there's something else to look at in your schools. Do you have a diversity committee made up of employees and student representatives, so that you can begin to promote not only LGBTQ issues, but all kinds of diversity? So we do something, we're planning something right now for Native American Heritage Month in November. We'll do something for Black History Month in February, Women's History Month in March. So that's another thing we can do to kind of nudge our institutions forward and make them more inclusive and open.
Thank you. Our next question, how has LGBTQ History Month evolved since 1994?
Well, in 1994, when we started, of course, I did not even have an email address. So it was all being done via telephone and the United States Postal Service, and it was slow moving. We had a group of us in Chicago around the Gerberhardt Library who formed a coordinating committee, and we just did it all ourselves. After a couple of years, we all went our own way, and then my idea always was that this event would just exist. And of course, the ultimate origin of the event is 1926, Carter Woodson, Negro History Week in February. He's considered the father of Black history. He was only the second African-American to graduate from Harvard with a PhD. And he believed that in what he called the great theater of events, African-Americans had played a crucial and unique role, and that needed to be recognized. And so he started Negro History Week in 1926. That evolved in the 1970s into Black History Month. And then you also had all the other Hispanic Heritage History Month, Women's History Month, and so on. So my idea was always that this would be a grassroots event, and that high schools and universities and colleges across the country and community-based institutions would simply run with the idea. You know, it exists. Now, LGBTHistoryMonth.com sort of serves as a center, if you will, of the event now because of what they're doing annually with the 31 icons that they choose. And there's some discussion now about maybe we need a little bit more of a centralized clearinghouse or location for all of these school and community groups that want to have some more information, books to read, posters to put up, and so on. So there's some talk about that as a next step.
Great, thank you. The next question, what is it like knowing that a month you founded is observed around the world?
It is very satisfying. And it has become more satisfying as I've gotten older because we begin to evaluate our lives. I remember turning 50 5 years ago was one of those occasions in which I really started to look back and figure out what I had done and not done. And the existence of LGBTQ History Month is a deeply meaningful event. And to know that it continues. And I don't Google myself, but in October, I Google LGBTQ History Month because I want to see what's going on at this university, what's going on in this community, what's going on in this school. This year, I've had the occasion to do about 10 of these events and have a couple more yet to do. And it's deeply meaningful because it indicates to me that I did something that has significance beyond myself that will live on even after I'm not involved.
Thank you. Do you believe recent changes to the makeup of the Supreme Court are a threat to DOMA?
Well, I must say, yes, I'm not pleased with what we've seen happening. When Justice Antonin Scalia died in his sleep in February of 2016, 400 days passed before Neil Gorsuch's confirmation hearing started. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, 24 days passed before confirmation hearings for Amy Coney Barrett started. Clear hypocrisy there, but that's sort of another political matter. I do have concerns because already Justice Alito and Justice Thomas have indicated that they would like to look back on the 2015 Supreme Court decision that made marriage equality the law of the land. So if they're wanting to revisit that question, it raises very important concerns. And there are many other issues too, you know, in the intersectionality of women and Black and minority and gay rights. There are other questions that are going to be coming before the court. There was the one just this week in which the court ruled 4-4 that in Pennsylvania, because of the pandemic and because of the slowdown in the mail service in some locations, they could continue to accept ballots as long as they had been postmarked by Election Day up to 3 days after the election on November 3. That was a 4-4 decision. If the current nominee to the court, who's under consideration by the United States Senate, were there, I doubt that that would have been a 4-4 case. So yes, I do have concerns, and probably it's pretty clear that, you know, my politics lean in a liberal direction. So I am concerned, very much so.
Thank you. However hard it is to hear, thank you for answering that question. As college and university faculty and staff, how can we be an ally to our out and questioning students?
I think the most important thing to do is in a classroom, one, perhaps highlight in your syllabus the non-discrimination policy of your school, particularly if it includes sexual orientation and gender identity. Prior to that being included here at my school in my syllabus, I would put our non-discrimination policy, and parenthetically, I would say, in addition, in this classroom, and then I would include that particular clause. So that's something that can be done. Just simply mentioning the existence of LGBT people. When you're talking about history, if you're talking about a human diversity class, if you're talking about human growth and development, if it's a general psychology class, if it's a sociology class, one cannot adequately teach these classes without a reference to the existence of LGBTQ people. And just saying the name has such power and such meaning in a classroom. Take it from me, I came to this school as a student in 1986 to 1988. And if I were to hear LGBTQ, or at that time probably just lesbian and gay, or maybe even just gay, I mean, that would have been, that sound would have been profound for me to hear. that there are people out there like that, and this person mentioned them and didn't say anything bad about them. So I think that's the most important thing. Make sure you got a GSA on your campus. Make sure your non-discrimination policy is inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity. And in October, make sure you're doing something, even if it's just a very small display or presentation in the library or in a highly trafficked area. That's enough. That one little thing has an echo that goes far beyond that one little thing.
Thank you. Those are great suggestions. What are your thoughts of the media's portrayal in present day?
Well, I think it's certainly gotten much better. I think you have a lot of LGBTQ characters on television today, and I think they generally are fairly typical characters. You know, there's that old cliche that's got some truth to it. You know, in the 1970s, a lot of the lesbian characters were murderers and a lot of the gay men characters were committing suicide. Well, thank goodness we've moved beyond that. And I think the media, I mean, it comes into all of our homes in a very intimate way, in our living rooms. And we grow accustomed to these characters and attached to these characters. And I think it's been instrumental in just making people more aware of and familiar with and comfortable with, and even to have love for these characters, because we do begin to love our characters on television. So I think it's been very important.
We have one more question and then we can start to wrap up. Just this morning, Pope Francis has called for civil unions for same-sex couples. What are your thoughts about this advancement for the Christian community?
This is news to me. So it happened this morning. Wow, I'll have to Google that as soon as I'm off here. I think that's great. I have appreciated many of the things Pope Francis has said in comparison to Benedict the 16th, I think it was, the retired Pope. That sounds good to me. I believe that marriage should be an institution open to all people. Now, he said there specifically civil unions because, you know, marriage is a sacrament in Roman Catholicism. But it's a big step forward to say we feel that states should authorize and recognize via the institution of civil union 2 men or 2 women who decide to devote their lives to one another. I'll be Googling that first thing when this ends.
Well, that's straight from Bobby. He passed that along to me. And I lied.
Right.
We have one more question. So I lied. Sorry about that. I literally physically hurt for anyone that is treated badly because they are different. I had a hard time watching the video. What do you think when you watch it? Do you feel like you are watching a different person? Does it bring back what you felt at the time? Or do you feel a sense of accomplishment for how resilient you were?
I feel accomplishment. I'm glad I went through it and survived. I did not know how traumatic it was, honestly, until 2 years ago when I dug out these VHS tapes from a box in the basement that I hadn't seen in 25 years. And I started the digitization process. And as I watched them, I felt anxiety rise up that I don't remember feeling at the time. I think when you go through something at the time, you're just marching through it. And I don't remember feeling the anxiety or the post-traumatic stress like I felt it when I started looking at these tapes as a 50, at that time, 53-year-old, looking at what a 29-year-old was doing, who's the same person, but much younger. So both. I feel a sense of accomplishment, and I also feel I couldn't do that now. At this point, it would be too overwhelming and be too much. Those were exhausting years, truly.
Oh, I bet. I can't even believe it. And I have a personal question, if you don't mind answering. How was your relationship with your dad when you came out? You had mentioned in the very beginning of the video some negative comments he had to say about gay people. So how was your relationship?
Well, my dad and I were very different people. He graduated from 8th grade, and that was the last day he attended a class or read a book, as far as I know. He was a woodsman and a countryman, and he liked motorcycles and stock cars. And when I first told my mother the story, when I was 26, she related to my father, who related to my sister, and he couldn't say the word. He said to my sister, "Did you hear about your brother? He's G-A-Y." Couldn't even say the word. So it took a while, but my dad was a loving and kind and good and decent man who was born in 1944 and had all the prejudices of men born in 1944. And he outgrew them. And he and I ended up with a very respectful relationship and a good relationship, which I'm thrilled about, because he died unexpectedly without any warning in 2004 at age 60. And I would be devastated if he had left this world, and at the time we were not on good terms.
Well, thank you for sharing. Okay, I don't see any more questions. With that said, if anyone does have a last minute question, feel free to type it in, but I will start to wrap up with a couple announcements. I first want to say thank you very much for presenting today. When the topic was approached to us, someone from your school sent us a tweet, and thank you very much. It meant a lot, and we were so glad that you were able to squeeze it in what, 2 weeks, I think we put this together, that you were able to squeeze it in October. We really appreciate your flexibility with us and your willingness to jump right in. Bobby and I will host a pre-convention webinar titled What to Know Before You Go, MCCA 2020, on November 4th at 10:30 a.m. Please sign up for that, especially if you've never been to a virtual convention or conference. It would be helpful for you. And with that said, convention is November 11th through the 13th. Many of your school's leadership have paid for all of their employees to attend. You can find out if this applies to you by visiting our convention website. It's very easy, mccaconvention.com. And then we will be sending a recording of today's webinar to everyone that registered via email. It is on our repository. You can share this with other people as well if you would like to. Again, you can share today's experience on social using hashtags MCCA webinar and LGBTQ History Month. Thank you again, Rodney. I hope you have a great day. Thank you, everyone that attended.
Thank you to everybody. Appreciate it.